And in local news, on Tuesday, New York City Mayor Eric Adams named attorney Mohammed Farid as the first Muslim member of the NYPD panel reviewing police spying into political activity. The Council on American Islamic Relations welcomed the appointment of Farid to the position of civilian observer on the committee named after another lawyer, Barbara Handschu, who began the litigation with the city in the 1970s, leading to a consent agreement on oversight of police intelligence gathering. One of the original attorneys in the case is Martin Stolar. In an exclusive interview with the News, he recounts the events that sparked the lawsuit and the significance of the Handcshu Agreement.
The mayor is continuing the position. He had the option of discontinuing it after 5 years, and he chose not to, which we think is all to the positive. Mr. Farid has an excellent background for the position. He's a partner at Patterson and Belknap, which is a large firm, but he's a graduate of the City University Law School, and he's been involved in civil rights litigation, so he's perfectly capable of separating evidence from fiction, and I think he's a good choice.
What exactly is this position? What does it do, and why? I guess you mentioned earlier that it could have been discontinued. What's the history of that?
Essentially, the Handschu Committee is an internal police department committee in the Intelligence Bureau, which authorizes the commencement, continuation, or closing of investigations that involve political activity or religious activity. Remember, where there's a mesh of criminal activity alleged along with political or criminal activity, those investigations have to be approved by a committee. Now, the committee is a group of high-ranking police department officers and lawyers within the department, and they're joined by an outside civilian. The civilian is not trained as a police officer, has a civilian's point of view, and is not jaundiced by the same kinds of internal divisions or attitudes that might govern the way the police look at things. Our experience in the last 5 years with Judge Robinson, who was a civilian representative, is that he served to sharpen their investigative activities. He was able to get them to sharpen up any allegations that they made about activity, get them to reject certain investigations. And while he didn't find any activities that he found were really over the edge, he served as an important reminder that the police department is subject to civilian oversight.
How did that apply to the recent George Floyd protests?
The Floyd protests and most of the arrests during Floyd were the result of demonstration activity. And the Intelligence Division, in theory, is not involved in investigating people who are involved in political demonstration activity. So you had, several thousand arrests. A lot of them were for curfew violations or for disorderly conduct, and there's really the Intelligence Division is not involved in that.
I see.
They certainly were involved in finding and putting undercover agents in or infiltrators into cases where they thought there was some kind of criminal activity, and succeeded in doing that in a couple of cases, some of which are questionable. But they didn't go overboard in the way they did with the Muslim community, which resulted in all the litigation that resulted in the establishment of having the civilian be subject to, call them to be subject to civilian oversight.
What has it become, especially since 9/11? It's become more watching on the Muslim community.
It was sort of unprecedented when it was filed in 1971. And when it was settled in 1985, it established what was known as an authority, which consisted of two high-ranking police officers and a civilian appointed by the mayor. And they operated with civilian oversight on what the Intelligence Division, what was then called the Intelligence Division, could do. The rule said you cannot investigate any kind of political activity except through the Intelligence Division. And this oversight group, the authority, was presumed to obtain the oversight, to keep the oversight, to keep them in line, to avoid the abuses that they had done in collecting political intelligence, infiltrating political groups, and collecting dossiers and files.
So the 9th Precinct in the Lower East Side, where there's a lot of political activists, can't just go off half-cocked and do a political investigation without it going through, as they might have been able to do in the past.
That's correct. They were restrained from just investigating pure political activity. They had to make some kind of an allegation that the people that they claimed to investigate politically were involved in some kind of criminal activity. And then they can justify or attempt to justify the investigation. Rudy Giuliani appointed this guy, David Cohen, who had a total background in the CIA and certainly no respect for the Bill of Rights, to be the head of the intelligence division. And he then lost no time in coming to federal court and saying, abolish these guidelines, abolish the authority. They're hampering our ability to investigate terrorism. And with the stench of 9/11 still hanging over the federal courthouse where we were hearing arguments about this, it was a close question. We succeeded in at least retaining a version of the guidelines as part of the court order. But the role of the authority and the role of a civilian was eliminated. And now investigations were commenced, continued, or closed solely on the word of an internal Handcshu committee, which was chaired by the commissioner of the deputy commissioner for intelligence, in this case, David Cohen. Naturally, this ran to the overboard investigation and surveillance of the entire Muslim community in New York. A total overboard investigation of anybody who was Muslim because they might be connected to, quote, terrorism, unquote. A series of investigations that were exposed by a couple of AP reporters in 2017 or so. That led to us going back to the federal court and saying, hey, Judge, they can't be trusted. Look what they've done. They violated every precept. They're investigating millions or hundreds of thousands of people with no connection to criminal activity. They're investigating every Muslim restaurant and eatery and community place in the city and mosque. They're putting undercover agents in, using infiltrators. They're doing all the things that they said they wouldn't do. So we got to stop it. We went back to court, and a new lawsuit was commenced in Brooklyn by a group of Muslim individuals and organizations called Raza versus the City of New York. And they were then both combined, and we got a new set of guidelines as a result of that collaboration. The new committee that approves guidelines and that approves or commences a continuation or closing of investigations now must contain the civilian representative. He's got a voice, and he's ordered to report any violations of the guidelines to the federal court, so that the police department operates with this little sort of a hook over their shoulder, saying you better behave yourself or else we're going to tell the federal judge that you're not doing so. Hopefully, that will restrain some of the excesses that they're prone to.
New York Attorney Martin Stolar on the Handschu guidelines for police spying. New York Attorney Ron Kuby has defended many political activists and others charged with political crimes in New York City and his working knowledge of the Handcshu Agreement.
Back in the 1970s, as sort of a response to many of the revelations that came out during the Black Panther trials, a lawsuit was filed against the City of New York and the NYPD alleging unlawful surveillance of lawful political activists. And that lawsuit, the lead plaintiff was Barbara Handschu, and that lawsuit wended its way through the courts until finally in the 1980s there was a settlement agreement that is known generally as the Handcshu Agreement. And the Handcshu Agreement prohibits police surveillance of legitimate activists, peaceful protesters, and the like, and requires there be some sort of reasonable basis for surveillance, reasonable basis to believe that people are going to be engaged in unlawful activity or violence. So that all sounds great. Those are great guidelines, but how do they get implemented? And the answer was there is a Handschu board, 9 of whom are appointed by the City of New York and consist of the intelligence chief and the police commissioner, et cetera, et cetera. They are accountable to a federal judge who oversees all of this. And periodically, There have been attempts to modify the Handcshu agreements after 9/11, for example. The police commissioner went into court and said, we need enhanced surveillance. We can't abide by these accords. Mayor Koch tried to change them at one point. But the basis, the fundamental framework still exists in terms of its prohibitions on the NYPD spying on legitimate political activists and other First Amendment protected activity.
The cops, since 9/11, they threw a lot of that, maybe not technically, but for practical purposes, out the window and just were in every mosque, every meeting.
There certainly were numerous Handschu violations in the aftermath of 9/11, and the guidelines were modified to allow some additional police activity, but the basic agreement has remained intact, and there has to be one civilian member on the board who is independent of the NYPD, and that member has the power to actually go directly to the federal judge and say there are Handschu violations going on here, there needs to be a remedy. The person who just recently retired was former Judge Stephen Robinson of the Southern District of New York. Oddly enough, he was one of the 2 black students at Cornell Law School when I was there. He became a federal judge. It's a 5-year term, and his term expired, and so Mayor Adams appointed Mohammed Farid as the new civilian member, and Mr. Farid is the first Muslim member, and he's getting kind of universal acclaim from everyone weighing in on this, from the lawyers in charge of the Handcshu Agreement, including Marty Stolar, and pretty much everybody across the board seems to think he's a great choice. He's okay.
Kuby says Farid is an expert and highly regarded by all sides, but Kuby adds Farid has a corporate background.
He works for a large law firm, Patterson, Belknap, Tyler, and Webb, a very accomplished attorney. Used to be a law clerk for the great federal judge Jack Weinstein, who was one of the great civil liberties judges who's since passed on. If somebody had asked me, which, by the way, nobody did, I probably would not have appointed an attorney who primarily represents corporate interests in hedge funds. I probably would have been able to find a Muslim attorney who is involved primarily in civil rights and social justice issues. But given how bad most of Eric Adams' appointments are to everything, this is like an A- at worst. So
the cases that were brought after the George Floyd protests, Black Lives Matter, where there was horrendous. I mean, what the cops did was horrendous, and there's lawsuits up the kazoo about this, and we're still waiting for decisions on that, I hear.
That's right. There was a lot of overtly unlawful policing in the George Floyd protests. I mean, brutality, kettling, arbitrary enforcement, excessive force, conflicting orders like, get out of here, freeze. Well, okay, which one should I do? Because I can't do both. And a number of demonstrators were injured. So those lawsuits are going on, and they're still examining whether or not the surveillance of BLM and other adjacent protests violated the Handcshu guidelines.
Kuby says while Handcshu is not a panacea, it does provide guardrails for the police.
The Handcshu guidelines and the Handcshu board, they're not some sort of magic solution to the problem of over-policing in New York. They're one thing that was developed to address sort of one problem. And they've done a decent job over the decades of doing that, very long-lasting. And the NYPD has gotten used to them. I'm not suggesting the NYPD adheres to the Handcshu guidelines, but the NYPD knows they exist and knows they can only go so far before they get dragged into court.
Activist attorney Ron Kuby. In related news, the organization Black Lives Matter brought a lawsuit against police spying on protesters. In 2019, a judge ordered the NYPD to turn over documents in the case, but the judge's order has been tied up in litigation ever since. The Handcshu guidelines were virtually scrapped after 9/11, but reports of untrammeled spying by the NYPD prompted new lawsuits and a reinvigorated Handschu board. And that's some of the news for Friday morning, February 24th, 2023. The news was produced by this reporter. You can catch the news at pauldirienzo.com. From New York City, I'm Paul DiRienzo. Thanks for listening.